Okay, so hello and welcome everyone to today's presentation at Trondheim Kunstmuseum. My name is Johan Borgesen and I'm the director of Trondheim Kunstmuseum. We are of course delighted to be involved in this conference for the Society for Artistic Research, as we are with all of our collaborations with the Art Academy in Trondheim. Trondheim Kunstmuseum is one of Norway's oldest art institutions. We trace our history back to 1845. And as an art museum, we work with different logics, different temporalities, if you will. That of the artwork which enters our collection, ideally, remains static and unchanged for eternity. Another logic or another temporality which affects our daily work very strongly is that of the temporary exhibition, which is a kind of proposal or a report on the state of things, presented to an audience for 1 to 3 months, and then we move on. A different kind of logic, or a different kind of temporality at least, is represented by artistic research. Artistic research presents us with methods and a vehicle for the act of thinking through art. So for this reason, it's an extra pleasure for us to have this perspective introduced into what we do at the museum. Again, thank you to Kunstakademiet and NTNU for involving us in the conference, and to the Society for Artistic Research. But most of all, of course, thank you, Yaniya Mikhalina, for the work in this exhibition, which will be discussed quite thoroughly, I think, during the next hour. So, without further ado, I give the microphone to Jakob Jessen.
Thank you very much, Johan. Yes. As Johan briefly introduced, so my name is Jakob Jessen. I'm head of department at the Academy of Fine Art in Trondheim, which is part of NTNU. I'm here to, in a way, introduce what Johan briefly talked about, the double or maybe even triple framework of this presentation. So in the sense that it's part of the public program and related to the exhibition Sisterless, which is also here, is one level. Yaniya is a PhD candidate with the Artistic Research Program at NTNU with the Academy of Fine Art, which is another level, and why we are formally now also presenting this as a midterm evaluation. And then on a third level, she is part of the 14-star conference in artistic research. So it's a great pleasure to, in a way, have this triple layer cake today. So, because of this formality, or not formality, but formal structure of the presentation, we have also invited Margaret Tarley with us today. And I would like to thank you very much for coming. She is a researcher with the Estonian Academy of Art, ECA, and focusing on matters related to contemporary modern art, memory and trauma, practices of curating and narrating cultural difference. So you are here as an external center to assess, and allow me please to quote the NTNU PhD regulations. If the overall scientific progress being made by the PhD candidate is sufficient to expect that they will complete their thesis on time. So that's the purpose. Also present today is Yaniya's main supervisor, professor in theory and documentary practices, Florian Snyder, who is also the president of the Society for Artistic Research. Allow me finally to just sum up the program for today. So we have now begun the first 40-minute slots, which will formally be Yaniya's presentation of the project and obviously also the artistic content. Then we will have a 10 minutes break, whereafter the external assessor will be responding to the presentation in a 40-minute slot, in which there will also be the possibility to have a moderated Q&A. I think that more or less concludes my formal structuring of our next couple of hours together. So, Yaniya, please.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming, and thank you, Jakob, for such a thorough institutional bureaucratic presentation of today. We are in the exhibition, so actually I decided not to show any parts of the work. So I hope that you will have time to see the works before or after. And yeah, as been said, my name is Yaniya, and I'm an artist, researcher, and filmmaker working with the concept of process-oriented documentary. And today we'll speak about the works that have been done over the course of the last 3 years of my PhD. And I will try to map the trajectory of my movement, impasses, and possible futures, directions within a context of class, state, sexuality, mental sickness, and language. The title of my research is Beyond the Reality Principles, Paths of Ethical Resistance in Madness, Coloniality and Patriarchy through the Lens of Process-Oriented Documentary Filmmaking. And rather fortunately, within the time frame of this presentation, and also according to my personal political beliefs, I won't have time to present a comprehensive picture of my research, but in order to stay with this non-linearity and materiality of works, I decided to focus on some concepts, milestones, methodologies, personal and theoretical memories to access the work process and its results on several levels, from affective to professional and bureaucratic, with multiple ends and beginnings. And partly I'm relying on psychoanalytic vocabulary because it's tailored to have a decentralized idea of a subject and subjectivity, and this is a general plane I'm working with and with which I speak across my exhibition. So the 3 works that are presented is a feature-length documentary Systelas about my friend Albina, who experienced a clinical psychosis, and her sister Almira, who also struggled with psychosis, and they both committed suicide over the course of 1.5 years. Second is an archival TV program that was filmed across Soviet cities right after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It's called Comrades, How Long Will You Torment Us? It's because of some construction work. It's located now in the lobby of the museum today. And the third piece is a video installation in the Volga-Ural sky, a work that juxtaposes sounds and images from family archives of indigenous people of the Volga-Ural region, where I'm from, and with Soviet avant-garde fiction and documentary films, representation of them. And namely 3 films. It's Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible from 1944, a silent costume film Bulat Batyr from 1928, and a culture film, documentary film Tatarstan, the Land of 4 Rivers from 1931. Documentary. The notion of documentary comes from colonial context from the very beginning as a genre. It's been created from impetus to depict more real life of the other to the civilized. And the history of documentary filmmaking is rooted in this seeming idea of objectivity, when in reality even the first so-called first documentary, Nanook of the North, was a fictional recreation. And this, I think, creates a lot of misunderstandings or multiple understandings of what documentary actually is, especially within the professional filmmaking context, which I don't consider myself belonging to. And when I call myself a documentary artist and researcher, I do not insist on belonging to a specific tradition nor of being outside of it. For me, documentary in a documentary practice means to situate form in the space of affect, making it accessible to others. It is also to be as materialist and literal as possible for those who aspire to stay in the reality of the embodied. I also want to highlight that I aim at taking decisions, editorial decisions, production-wise, conceptual and social, in order to focus on libidinal spaces that have political context and are relatable. By pathology and pathological forms of reality, including the reality of fantasy, I do not appeal to any norm. I decided to highlight it as a key word in order to insist on demedicalization and debiologization of its usage. Pathology, as I use it, is in opposition to an ethics that is determined by the capacity of having a relationship with the other. Psychoanalyst Alenka Zupancic conceptualizes this as an ethics of the real, an ethics that is inseparable from the form it takes, a reality in which we insist on non-removability of different subjectivities and the presence of the other. In the context of filmmaking, I want to quote film reader Erika Balsam, who is in her answer to the potential of film's reparative relation to an embattled real, proposes that, I quote, it might involve assembling rather than dismantling, fortifying belief rather than debunking false consciousness, love rather than skepticism, end of quote. And so the notion of documentary and documentary practices becomes an ethical position of problematizing reality, a refusal to perceive it as neutral and objective space equally accessible from the perspective of different subjectivities. The exhibition, in the context of which this conversation takes place, presents my artistic research project that revolves around practicing, conceptualizing, and imagining feminist and decolonial filmmaking and the ways in which reality represents, produces, and distorts subjectivities. In a rather performative manner, I also perceive this exhibition as body without organs, where each work addresses different instances: I, unconscious, memory, eyes, ears, and so on. Fantasies from above. I really like that it's, apropos just exposing, now one of the works is playing, and the sound is also important soundtrack of this text. With the concept fantasies from above is also connected to this notion of documentary. And of course, we deal with fantasies produced by structural divisions of our modern, gendered, institutionalized, capitalist-friendly ways of living. These fantasies establish a hierarchy of forms of production, modes of life, sexualities, political geographies, and representations. I mainly address fantasies produced by the state and other power positions. That's why they're called fantasies from above. And nation states should not only be seen as legislative and institutional structures, but also psychic structures that react to those legislative and institutional constellations. As nation states are using grand ideas such as nation, freedom, equality to legitimate and produce their power, to monopolize the forms of resistance, desire, and becoming. These grand ideas produce exterior representations, often driven by generic masculine fantasies. Fantasies which constitute the form of violence in themselves. My interest in engaging with fantasy, or to be more precise, in listening to the fantasies as documents, lies in the absence and lack of documents from where I come from, as well as the difficulty to fit the territory of Tatarstan, which is a Muslim republic in Russia, which been annexed by Moscow state in the 16th century. And also we had a very strong movement of leaving Russia in the 90s, but because of geographical position in the center, it never led to independence, as with other Muslim republics and autonomous republics on the border of Soviet Union. So this is somehow where I situate one of the beginnings of this interest, and being from a territory that has so many fantasies projected on it. And filmmaking, of course, has a lifelong relationship with the gaze and fantasies already on the level of technology. The gaze of the camera, the gaze of the other, the gendered gaze, the colonial gaze are participating in each other's world making, constantly blending and overlapping. Moving images allow to touch the spaces and bring them together as they are, as well as something between them. For me, as a documentary filmmaker, it is important to support the knowledge about the illusionary character of any kind of representation, to work with the space between the eye and the gaze, so the viewers would feel materiality of it, its openness and liability. Structurally speaking, this fragile interlayer is what makes the reality-based community possible. While in the moment an implicit assurance in the reality of a certain identity occurs, the figure of the other disappears, and the reality-based community becomes an imaginary one. To use Lacan's example, if a man who thinks he is a king is mad, a king who thinks he is a king is no less so. When entering the discussion of imperialism on the territories of Moscow State, Russian Empire, Soviet Union, and the Russian Federation from a decolonial perspective, one has to differentiate between external and internal others. As seen in numerous examples, the rationale of filmmakers of the newly founded Soviet state was indeed not very different on a structural level to the logics of the old empires. For example, the presence of Slavic Russians as a default category of citizens. I want to quote Oksana Sarkisova here, who was part of the opening of this exhibition. Accepting Russians as a separate category from the ethnographic gaze, Soviet culture films opposed backwardness to a default modern identity which tied Russian and Soviet into a tight knot. The urgency to listen to the world-making of the psychotic as a political category and take it serious as a document, as a relationship of the subject to the discourse of the other, to the signifiers and to the borders of reality, comes from its semblance with the imperial world-making. Fantasy in its radical form of delirium is a collective enterprise which doesn't oppose the reality of social production. And in this boundless space, akin to the one produced by empires, there is nothing to lean on within the space of delirium. Naturally, the reality in this space is made of the fantasies independently shared by everyone who lost the sense of scale. On the level of colonial thinking, and in my work, I deal with it from representations of indigenous people of the Volga-Ural region in Soviet avant-garde films. You see this promoted idea of enforced equality, or rather sameness between indigenous people of the diverse backgrounds by this new old common denominator of Soviet and Russian identity. A very generalized version of Orientalism. I'm referring to my works. I can imagine actually that now that if it's a lot of people who haven't seen it, it might be difficult to access it, but basically you would see the juxtaposition of home videos from the region and the Soviet documentaries and fiction films, where somehow this fantasy, Oriental fantasy of Tatar is being addressed on different with different nuances, to say, and in different historical contexts. And I always, when I was doing this work, I was always thinking about my mother telling me the story from her childhood. She's a Soviet child, and when she was 4, she cried a lot when she learned that Lenin is not Tatar. That it's just to have this example of how this fantasy from above is working, and on a 4-year-old child, Tatar child. I've been also thinking a lot how to describe my cinematic methodology, given that I don't film a lot, or rather I don't film everything, and also I work a lot with archives, but when I work with archives, it's never a ready-made archive, but an archive to be constructed, which is consisting of pieces, scratches, abandoned things. So the task of building the archive is equally important as work with an archive itself. And usually filmmakers or artists also use a prefix "re" when they work with the existing material. This doesn't quite suit me. And for example, when I work with early Soviet documentary footage and amateur videos, my goal is not to re-edit them and change its meaning or repurpose it in order to create something new. Rather, the desire to work with existing materials comes from understanding that I cannot pretend that something has never existed before or never has been addressed and so on. We always start from somewhere. Even if we don't allow this thought to come to our consciousness, it exists in our unconscious. So the desire to work with these leftovers of discourse is more a recognition of this fact, that there is always something before that is needed to address as a political task. And overwriting is a concept that appears in Freud's text, a mode upon a mystic writing pad. And this is a mystic writing pad, like a mass-produced one that consists of 2 layers, and writing, and he compares this instrument, this technology, to the memory that when we write on the first layer, it always leaves a barely visible traces on the second layer, even when we remove, when we erase the message on the first. So there is always something that remains. And this is how memory works. It never comes to an empty space. It always it's constantly being produced and constantly being overwritten. And that's how I see the relationship between visual and non-visual part of the images. And there is also, within the exhibition, there are 3 cinematic works and 1 sculptural photographic work, which is a bloody motherland. You can see it afterwards. It's a residue of the film, of the prop that's been used in the film, because partly we filmed it in Volgograd, and Volgograd is former Stalingrad. And in Soviet times, the Ukrainian architect Evgeny Vutechich, he did 2 sculptures, the motherland sculptures, one in Volgograd and one in Kiev. And the one in Volgograd has a sword, and the one in Kiev had a shield. And after the film has been done before the beginning of full-scale invasion of Russia to Ukraine. But of course, after the beginning of the war, it was somehow necessary to address and to put again another layer of meaning and meaninglessness in the work. So I decided to produce this photograph, which is with a 3-meter photograph of a 3-centimeter toy souvenir of this sculptures, the one in Volgograd. This is behind the scenes of the film, and it's a nice, I think, scheme of the gaze, of how the camera gaze working with me, being together but behind the camera. And I want to address the question of feminization of production. In a broader sense, it's not about certain decisions or set of rules that connect it with the discourses of care and healing and things that we usually associate with kind of a feminist and feminine work. But of course, it doesn't go without them. But most importantly to me, feminization of production is about specificity of the context and singularity of the production situation, which kind of allows us to stay ethical towards it without predetermined set of ethical rules or do's and don'ts. In the same logics, process-oriented production and filmmaking, does it mean that process is more important than result? Because result is also part of the process of listening and opportunity of learning, of staying open and not just observing. I can give examples from my own production situations. another statement is that for me, feminist production and feminist filmmaking is to give participants what she wants from the situation of production. It's not about questioning what she wants, but of course I can reflect on it formally in a certain ways. And for example, Albina, the main protagonist of the film Sisterless, that will be played right after our discussion here, if you have a chance to stay and see it. She had a desire to be. It was important for her to be, apart from telling her story and reflect on psychosis on personal and political level. It was important for her to be conventionally cinematically beautiful, in a way which can be criticized in a certain political context of representation of female character. But it was important to her. Also given her story of her relationship with the body. Or the other thing is that she also had a friend who wanted to become a filmmaker but had no clue about how to get away with it. So she asked if she can join us on the set and on traveling together. And of course it was kind of complicated to have another person running around the shot and another kind of budget restriction, but we decided that it's again like if one would take the situation of production as an open situation and not as a kind of professional milieu in which everything already kind of follows this logics of effectivity, of logics of kind of capitalist forms of labor division and working with professionals, etc. Then like as the opposite, what we did, we allowed the situations to unravel, and like having her family in parts of the shot, around, and including life in a way into the production process. And it's a necessity, not a luxury, to take time and make pauses, even if it would take longer. For example, in post-production, it was also a situation that our sound composer and designer had a difficult time in life, so we paused it for a little bit, like the production, because it was a necessity, like psychological necessity, to slow it down at this moment. And I must confess that the person to whom I often fail to apply this is myself, because but I am working on it. For example, this exhibition opened on my due date, and so I gave birth 5 weeks ago, and it's been really a little bit difficult to prepare for this presentation today. I'm not justifying myself, but I'm just also sharing with you something which has informed, I think, certain decisions that have been taken in terms of how I speak about my work today. Camering, kind of VC filming. Camering is a concept that I borrow from educator and writer Fernand Deligny. For many years, the decennials from 1940s to until his death since 1990s, he has developed a model of being together with autistic and psychotic children outside institutional setting, without trying to educate them or to make them convenient to the society. And camering was a way of being together, which he found an important language in working with those to whom written language was of no or limited interest. He considered camera as a tool to establish relationship with the other. I quote, "With the camera, the world looks at them, the world of others who had nothing to do with them and who would later be a witness to what they do every day." End of quote. So for Deligny, camera is an instrument, and in camering, unlike filming, there is no intentionality. And the director doesn't place herself in the position to fulfill the viewer's wishes. Together, for example, to come back to this example of being beautiful, and conventionally beautiful. I quote another quote from Deligny: "A film needs a subject, while camering attempts to evoke what lies beyond the purview of the subject, whether it be a director or the viewer of that work." End of quote. So I see camering rather as a point of seeing that retains traces of what takes place in the frame that is distinct to it. It also challenges the logic of representation from visible and invisible, aesthetical and political, bon and mauvais tons, and shifts its attention to and importance to the economical. It is what it is, and if it happens, it remains unexplained. Because, I quote, "To camera in filming is to risk to disappoint others." And in my installation in the Volga-Ural sky, I try to deal with these layers of history and colonial temporalities not through words and critical reflection, but purely through images of daily life and celebrations. Also because there is a certain temporality of the exhibition, and the Systemless is a piece with a lot of words and language. It has quite a heavy presence in it, and there are also other ways and other languages through which we can address certain things and things that are not accessible or has its limits in the written language. To just expose propaganda films which overdetermine the audience with home videos free of any intentions is to camera in an archival form, to escape counter-propaganda gesture, but to build another history of Volga-Ural women as historical subjects and voices that sound in their own manner, parallel to the colonial gaze. Because this is yet another topic about some kind of title representation of indigenous people. It's when it comes from the state and mixed with this fantasies from above, it's usually a lot about, some kind of costumes and or in some kind of capitalist setting. It also can deal with a certain identity. But to me, working with this home videos was freeing and liberating. This representation of how it should look like, or how the rituals look like. So it's people who, and also my own family archives of how you enjoy and practice things without thinking about how they've been represented, and how they look like in this kind of very purified way, in a parallel to the colonial gaze. Language. Speaking about language, I won't address a specific language today, even though the relationship, for example, between Russian and Tatar are an important part and subject of my practice, but rather the role of language as a structural element. Before I was also speaking about this interlayer, between eye and camera, so something that mediates our experiences and in the case of my exhibition, it's traumas of a different scale and different contexts that are connected to each other. And yes, I said that I address different linguistic capacities because to come back again to Systemless, that the narration is built on over the voice of main protagonist and the conversations that we had with her over the course of 1.5 years. So we can hear kind of different tonalities, different states also in terms of how close she was to her like psychotic experience or some things that happened in her life. So it's almost a conversation that she has with herself that you can listen to the sound and. At the same time, she's also brilliantly explains and theorizes upon why it happened. And but as we also know, so she delivers this psychoanalytic and Marxist analysis of events of her life, and she's very articulated. But at the same time, we know that this knowledge didn't free her from pain and didn't ease her burden of being alive, of being sister, of being Tatar, of being woman, of being a working class woman, of living in Russia, and that her delirium came back, and she decided to take her own life. But and it's also kind of reflects on the state in which I was, after it happened. That what else can be said, and has anything, be said further, and that's why I want to speak actually about a kind of a transitory figure, and this figure appears in my piece "Comrades, How Long Will You Torment Us?" So for those who hasn't seen it, It's a TV program that I re-edited from the early 90s that had been filmed in the Soviet Union shortly after the dissolution, where people in different post-Soviet cities speak about the situation in which they found themselves. And mostly it's quite serious, that, people have nothing to eat, or, they don't understand what is the government, what is the country they're living in. And there were, of course, a lot of also military conflicts, and people speak about Pridnestrovia, people speak about, having to fight from someone with whom they'll be fighting together. So on one side, so it's a lot of kind of repeating the narratives that we deal with now, and with the legacy that has not been kind of digested. And it's almost also formally looks like this post-Soviet stomach. But there is one person, a boy from Odessa, and everyone is there because given 1 minute. So you go to the space and you have 1 minute to say what you think. So then there is one boy from, part of it is filmed in Odessa, and there's one boy from Odessa, and he comes and he doesn't say anything, he just chuckles around the microphone. So he's like, and then he leaves. So that's kind of, and to me, kind of, I decided to keep this because it's a transitory figure, from dealing with a microphone, with a space where you can say something, but you actually have nothing to say, not because you're out of words, but just because it's structurally impossible for many reasons, and this is where. This is from where kind of I started also this new piece that has no words in it, which has only voice and music and singing of Tatar singing and Mishar singing as a kind of voice as a form, or how we can listen for something, not looking for the meaning, but taking it in its entirety. And this is why it's important to address it artistically, because the formal question is equally important as a question of the meaning, the physicality of it. So it's kind of noise in a broad sense as a form of memory, remembrance, resistance, and the shift from meaning to the revolutionary potential of the form itself. And reality principle is another concept borrowed from psychoanalysis and analytical setting. And in general, I think I'm occupied with this translation of certain psychoanalytic concept, from cabinet setting to kind of more political, situations in a way. So it's, again, as I said in the beginning, it can take different forms, but with this idea of subjectivity, decentralized subjectivity in the center. And reality principle has nothing to do with objectivity or neutrality. On the contrary, for Freud, it's an economic principle. And I've been talking about it translated to the context of documentary filmmaking and artistic research. When reality is recognized, even if it is a reality of silence and distortion, we still give it a place. In the film setting, it converts to that the result, including the logics of representation, would be shaped by necessities and chances. In the context of my practice of the temporal spaces stretching from Moscow state to post-Russia, and in reality of Russian full-scale invasion, empires cannot be or should not be either forgotten, neither ignored. That would mean to refuse things that do not belong to them and were taken without asking, appropriated and imagined, or simply looked at. It would mean not to acknowledge politics behind every act of forgetting and the violence of ignorance. And my film, Sisterless, it starts from the image on the right, the main protagonist in the labyrinth of mirrors. And I want to end my presentation with a photograph outside of this image, so where it's been filmed actually. Because, I want also to address some of the critiques about, again, this kind of what is seen, that it's a very, it might be seen as a quite conventional representation of, somebody who's experiencing psychosis, like mirrors and a tripled figure, but actually the reality behind it and other cheap dreamlike scenes that you'll see in the film is a reality of this resort town Adler, in which we filmed the part of the film where Albina's mother worked as a cleaner, and there is this amusement park that we passed on the way to her, and another part of also kind of in a similar aesthetics that been night scenes that were filmed in the local park, which family wanted to visit for a while, so we decided to combine again act of filming with the act of visiting it. And so it's really very simple, like in this example with a microphone as a physical object. It's there and you kind of approach it and you use it without any kind of symbolization behind it. And it's not explained because I think, as Deligny again, that when you're making films, you disappoint, and you have to be ready to disappoint people in a way. So it's a idle task of trying to over-explain something. And in every embodiment shaped by necessity, impossibility, and interpretation, in every act of speaking, that three passes establish categories of gender, class, ethnicity, state. They could be another end to someone else, and that's why I choose to continue working, even though in some temporalities and context it might seem that there is no meaning in it. And I encourage others to continue their own way in our different realities, but hopefully shared in its commitment to ethics. Thank you. It's very timely. It's exactly 40 minutes. Yes.
And you can go out to the reception, find some refreshment, use the bathroom, and then we start.
What? Yes, maybe you can also have a look at works. I mean, you cannot have a look at the film, but yeah, because of the construction now it's not accessible, but there is one work in the film and the VHS in the reception area.